My name's Justin Piccarelli. I'm at the University of Wyoming, so not far. My question kind of, I guess, gets to why we're here in part. What do you think the role of policymakers can actually be in this environment? Because I was struck by some of your presentation in particular, because I was thinking about government's accused of being slow, and for good reason, because I think they're accountable for their actions. Obama made some reforms, so now it takes 102 days to hire a federal worker, right? And that was a big deal, like that's fast. So can policy even keep up with technology, given technology goes with the free market, right?
I'll start with that. As a policy person by background, I'll start with that. The federal government in particular is slow moving, and while we're in a phase of more dramatic partisanship than we have been before, it takes longer to come to the consensus. But you don't get to consensus, at least in Congress and in changing federal law in the first place, without having options to evaluate. And so one of the reasons that we, in our project at least, started with state and local governments is because we wanted to see some of the experiments that are going on in communities around the country, to be able to pull those things out and say, look, this is working in different contexts. So I think that we've got to have some stuff for people to be able to point to say, and this works for this demographic, or this works in getting people connected with this kind of education, or this works in this context, and then you can do that. I think that some of the things that Scott was highlighting on some of the experimental things that are going on in collecting data about how it actually works to distribute income is in that context one of the things that's happening. Our project is agnostic about any particular thing, but thinks that there needs to be more and more experiments to get new ideas out there.
So, go ahead. So we tend to think that policy has to be federal, but one of the strengths of our federal system was there are 50 states, and these are 50 laboratories for different policies, recognizing there are also differences between the states. In fact, one of the rationale when I was talking to Jim about running this summit here, and I said, why Wyoming? And the answer was one, it's a small state, really one 4-year academic institution. And so one could imagine that you start thinking, okay, what do we need to do in the state of Wyoming? And including what do we do in the area of higher education, which is one area of the policy. And so if the state's starting to do some more of the experimentation, we will gradually perhaps learn. We don't have necessarily only to experiment in Namibia. We can experiment here in the United States, not just about basic income, but about other areas as well. And hopefully, eventually, the federal thing always comes last, not first.
I also just want to point out, too, that this is also kind of a discussion between universality and targeting. So when the normal is a targeted benefit from your large governments, then that can actually be quite difficult to handle, say, changes in the labor markets. But that's why one of the reasons that we need to go more towards universal programs. So you need something like universal basic income, universal health care, universal education, these kinds of things that don't focus on only targeting to certain people like we used to. So I think that it's more like the creation of something that reduces the friction in this. So as the labor market changes and we have something that doesn't have this kind of friction that we have right now, then governments can actually they're more able to meet these changes.
So this question will go back to what Jeff asked before about the gender implications of some of what we're looking at. And Kristin, this probably starts with you. Bobby Schnabel, Colorado. So you were talking about the analysis in 4 new job categories or job classes that you had identified coming up. And for instance, the first one of those, the creative lifestyle workers, sounded like it might have actually gender preferences one way or the other. But I was curious in that analysis of the new job categories whether there had been any analysis of the gender implications of those categories.
It kind of depends, because in a lot of the creative lifestyle work, it overlaps with startups, and so it can be startups in, hydroponic farming or whatever, something that is a human enhancing thing that is neutral and can be started by anybody, or it can be stuff that we associate right now with female dominated jobs like elder healthcare or childcare. But I think even those things are changing, and part of it has to do with how you frame it. We get a lot of things, particularly associated with schools, that if you frame something as coaching, men are much more likely to do it than if you frame it as teaching. If you frame something as in healthcare as having to do with the technical side of healthcare rather than having to do with the care side of healthcare, so even if you talk about nursing as, technical analysis of disease progression or something, you get more male applicants. So I think that it's not necessarily a growing thing for something that's dominated by one gender or another, just in these are the things that we see emerging, and we need to make an effort to involve everybody in those options.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that and we've talked a little bit about this, but the way that we are working is changing, such that I think we need to really think differently about the kind of new forms of work. So as an example, I myself am crowdfunded via Patreon, and so you can essentially say that I've created my own job. I think that there's a lot of work out there that can be done by people that they'll be more able to do. Again, one of these big effects is self-employment. So I think that as these jobs kind of disappear, that on the one hand, with a basic income, they'll be more likely to be able to create their own work. And second, I think also there needs to be a focus on bringing the hours of work down, so more of like work sharing. This idea that, let's say, there's such a concern that half of our jobs are going to be gone in 20 years. Well, we could all be just as employed if we just worked half as much. We could share this labor more. So I think that needs to be part of this discussion as well. But I think, there's just an inherent flexibility to this floor that's always there. Once you have that, you don't have to jump through these hoops, and also you're not disincentivized from actually looking for work, which is actually part of the safety net right now. Like right now, if you fall into this system, then you're receiving these benefits, and then if you find work, then you're going to lose the benefits. So you have to make this kind of calculation as, I have to find a job that's good enough, or else there's no point to it. But if you have a floor, then any amount of work is actually better than no work. And so it actually makes part-time work more appealing, which again makes sense because part of this transformation of work, I think that this notion of full-time careers are just kind of disappearing anyways. I think it's kind of a temporary existence. And I think that we're going to go more towards part-time work. And I think that fits a lot more with that as well.
Okay, Jim Caldwell, University of Wyoming. So both Scott and Kristin, your stories sort of revolve around the gig economy, describing a gig economy. So what do you think of the Bureau of Labor Statistics report that was just released? The New York Times headline a few days ago said, maybe the gig economy isn't reshaping work after all. Do you have any? And Moshe, feel free to chime in as well. It wasn't as fundamental a part of your talk.
So I've kind of been looking at BLS data now for over 10 years. And this data is really invaluable. But it always answers questions that have been asked usually decades ago, with definitions that have been established decades ago. And so the people, even people who know, are always bemoaning how difficult it is to come up with more quickly with new questions or change the definition as the circumstances have changed. So the BLS data here is an outlier. Every other study that look at alternative work arrangement, and as a broader notion than just the gig economy, every such measure, I think one of you, I don't forget which one, mentioned that all the jobs essentially have been created since the Great Recession. And not all, but in the 90-something% are all what they call alternative work arrangements. And this has to do with just the fact that the job that we think is a normal job is a 9 to 5, 40 hours a week. This covers a smaller and smaller fraction of the population. And there are people who work multiple jobs just because that's the only way they can make a living. Well, they don't fall under the gig economy now. So the BLS took incredibly narrow definition, and therefore it's only 3%. But if you look at the broader category of alternative work arrangement, there are many other estimates that it's about 1/3 now of the workforce and growing, okay? I mean, we can look at higher education, right? We think that the gold standard, of course, is a tenure track job. And I think now, there are people who probably know this better than me, but I think it's maybe 30% or lower are these gold standard of academic jobs. And now we have the contingent academic workforce is now around 70% or even maybe more.
So just to build on that a little bit, on the technical side of that survey, there are a couple of things that give it a less than complete picture. One is that the question itself is this your full-time job? And so that automatically eliminates anybody who's working in the on-demand world or freelance generally as a side hustle. Two, it's have you gotten income from a freelance source or an on-demand source in the last, I think, week, maybe 2 weeks. And so that, what we see all the time is people who are using on-demand work do it on an intermittent basis when they need to or want to. And then thirdly, that it sort of isn't focused on it's only focused on the labor platform things, not the asset things. So Etsy, Airbnb, things where you are either selling something and using an electronic platform to be the go-between on that, or selling it, earning income from an asset aren't included in that. So those are sort of the three technical things. On the anecdotal side, what I hear and see from people across the country over and over again is that people love the on-demand economy when it is something that they are using to get to a transitional goal. They're using it to pay for education, they're using it to pay off debt, they're using it because they want to take their kids to Disney World. It's whatever the thing is, if they have a specific goal for it, it's great. If they are doing it because they can't find the thing that they actually want to do instead, and are doing it because they're sort of forced to aggregate lots of income sources to make ends meet, it's much more problematic. I don't know how you're ever going to get data to capture that stuff.
I just want to mention one quick story because I think it actually fits in really well with AI, is just to consider this possibility that say 20 years in the future or something, and you've got a whole lot of AI doing a whole lot of jobs for us. Okay, so we're going to have edge cases. You can imagine an AI is going to have a problem and say, oh, well, I can't figure this one out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this to the on-demand market, and a human's going to do this job. So it's going to be like a whole lot of these kind of on-demand tasks that can fill in the holes that the AIs can't do. I think it's just it fits really well with the future.
Patrick Johnson from the University of Wyoming. I had a question about the lack of how compensation doesn't track with productivity in the last decade or two. How is that tracked with other developed countries? Is that unique to the United States, or is that something that's more global?
So one of the things that as you look across international spectrum, we focus here mostly in the United States, but you look international, you find that policy does matter. So we talked about it's difficult to formulate policy, but boy, policy does matter. So there is a general phenomenon of decline of labor, so to speak. This is pretty much a global picture. But the degree to which labor declined varies dramatically between different countries. So again, we look at the drop of, for example, the decline in manufacturing labor force. And people mention Germany as an example that have a thriving manufacturing sector. But again, over the period that our manufacturing labor force declined from 25% of the population to something about 8% today, Germany declined from 40% to 25%. So it's still, 25% is where we were 40 years ago maybe, but they are still declining, okay? But they have industrial policy, which we don't have. So they're trying to slow it down. They're doing taking all kind of measures that we are not taking.
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit to that too. It's really interesting to look at why the U.S. has seen such a decoupling. And also, if you look at other countries, you'll see that decouplings happened later to not as large a degree. Wages are still good in other places, but there's still the kind of this overall general trend that's going on.
But I just saw in the news just in the last couple of days that Google is deciding they're going to do something about the wage stagnation. I mean, kind of, in some sense, harking back to Ford, who realized that people need to buy the cars and you need a thriving middle class to buy the car. So on one hand, you produce the car, lower the price, but also paid well his worker because that's great market and they will enable you to reduce the cost of production.
Carolyn Lavander, Rice University. Each of you has described the challenges and opportunities within a national context. And I'm curious the extent to which this is maybe a global quandary. And any perspective or thoughts you have on that, I'd be very interested in.
I'm happy to comment on it. So people have looked, there's something that came out a few years ago, it was became known as the elephant curve. And it was by an economist at, I think, the CUNY Graduate Center. And it looked how globalization has benefited people globally. So you look at the income spectrum from very, very poor people to very rich people, globally. So as you go back and you look at poor people, and the very poor has not benefited much. They stayed very dirt poor, they stayed dirt poor. But after that, you see income rising significantly. And so globalization has raised about 1 billion people out of abject poverty. That's an amazing accomplishment. Anybody's talking about globalization, that's an amazing accomplishment. It's one of the best things our planet has seen in the past generation. 1 billion people pulling out of abject poverty. And that describes the hump of the elephant. And then educated professionals have benefited. And again, you see a rise. And this is the trunk of the elephant. But then you have stagnation and decline for working class and middle class people in developed countries. And that's where you see suddenly, so you see this, the hump, the head, the trunk. And that's why it became known as the elephant curve. And so, been huge benefit, but partly what you are seeing, that politics is still national. And you can say, oh, well, overall it's benefited the humanity, so you guys don't complain, it has worked well. What we are seeing is in developed country, we've seen this economic stagnation, and now many people correlate it very directly with the rise of populism. People think these policies have not benefited them. Now what happened as we look forward, so one of the issues, what will happen to, for example, one of the things that happened in developed countries is certain industry migrated to low-cost countries, okay? So if everything that we are wearing was probably not produced in this country. Well, it's actually turned out, for example, making sneakers is hard to automate, but by now, there are, I recently read it, there are now sneaker factories coming back to Germany. It's not 100% automated, it's about 90% automated. And that means that countries that right now house these low-cost industries, they have to worry about what will happen to them. And even more, what happens as country industrializes, labor cost goes up. So we used to do this cheap manufacturing in China, and then it had to move to Malaysia, to Vietnam. And people say, where's the next place it's going to move to? Well, Africa. But if it could be that we're going to automate stuff before it has a chance to move to Africa, so now there is discussion of people called premature deindustrialization. What happens if the cost of the machinery goes down faster in such a way that Africa does not have a chance to industrialize? So it's a complex global picture. There are always winners and losers.
I'll add on to this too, and I think there's a good example of a possible solution to this, because if you're looking at Africa, it's wrong to say that Africa is, say, poor or something. I mean, there is a wealth of natural resources. We will need things like lithium, for example. Is that there's a high demand for this stuff, and there's a whole lot of demand for these natural resources. The problem is right now those natural resources are the benefits, the wealth are going to a smaller percentage of people in those countries, and they're not shared with the people. So in India right now, there's a growing movement called the Goa movement, and they want to essentially copy Alaska's model and apply it to, say, the mineral resources there in India, and saying that just like in Alaska, everyone in Alaska essentially owns their share of the oil, that revenue should be invested in a permanent fund, and that permanent fund should pay a dividend. So they're looking at the same thing. And you can do that essentially in all these places that we consider to be undeveloped and like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to them? Well, they still have a wealth. It's just a matter of making sure that the wealth accrues to everyone instead of just a few people.
Yeah, so I think of things in terms of solutions too, and think that the most interesting part of the international question in relationship to this is what technologies can we pull from other countries to help Americans, and vice versa. So for me, that jumps out as micro-lending and crowdsourcing, and some of the stuff that happens in other countries could be used in areas that are still kind of developing here and in different circumstances. And then the reverse is that what can those countries learn from the way that the United States has used different kinds of platforms to connect people in different ways. And I think in both cases, you're applying those technologies to this question of, we have currently lots of people in specific categorized kinds of jobs, and you really need to move to something where many fewer people have many more diverse sources of income, and many more people have just a one-off job. And there are some real lessons that I think we can learn in the United States from countries that do that more successfully.
So I have a comment about the gig economy and our educational response to automation. My great-grandmother came to the US in the late 1890s, and she worked in the gig economy. It was called a sweatshop. This was undifferentiated human labor, which is essentially what the gig economy does. It turns human beings into a commodity. They're all the same. There is nothing that differentiates them. This does not seem to me a positive direction. So in some sense, the fact that the BLS found there weren't a lot of people working in it, I thought was a very positive thing. On the other hand, I think Kristin is right. If you just have a short-term goal, it's a great thing. So the question is what do we do as educators to make sure that we're not undifferentiated mass of human beings, and everybody has a little bit of a quirk that matches some interesting job? We're all individuals, and then we can get and do something that is meaningful, because it's not just about putting food on the table at some point. So, I just think we should beware of the gig economy. It's a throwback to 200 years ago.
I agree with that in some circumstances, and maybe even in many circumstances, but I don't think in all circumstances. And the reason that I see people liking the gig economy in circumstances where they're using it for a transitional goal is because they're using it to launch themselves into something more entrepreneurial. And so for me, that's the way that we should all be thinking about the on-demand and independent work. How can you use that as the launch platform to do the thing that you actually want to do, to use your skill as the thing? And you're right, if everybody's just, running groceries on Fiverr forever afterwards, as their 20-year-long career, that's not a great use of that. But if you're using it in a way to sort of create economic stability while you're trying to get to something else, or you're thinking about how to use it to enhance your skills and let you find more markets and applications for that, that's the goal of the technology.
We have to be careful. I mean, the people who usually are having the discussion are people who it's fair to describe that most of their own work is typically self-directed and self-actualizing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's kind of a tendency to say, well, these are the only job worth having. But if you look at there is a tremendous amount of literature on the psychological value of work, more broadly. And the answer is that for most people, not all jobs, there are many people that hate their jobs and they couldn't get to wait out, but for most people, even jobs that is not necessarily self-actualizing, is something that they find great value. They feel needed, they're providing, it's a social context. I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but this is all incredibly well established, including what happened to people, for example, who lose their job, even if they find still some way to survive economically. It creates in all kind of social, of psychological ills when somebody loses this anchor in their lives. So we have to think of work in a more broad way. And this is, to me, one of the issues that I never quite understood with UBI, I have to admit, is we have to think not just about how to ensure that people can make a living, and I think that's very important, and lift them out of poverty, but what gives people meaning to their life, which is a very old question, going back to you can go back all the way to Socrates, right? What gives people meaning to their life? And the general answer, what gives you meaning to your life is the feeling that you are needed, that you are useful. And partly it goes, are you doing work that ultimately you feel that is making a societal contribution?
So I think both of you are missing my point. Yes, you get to put food on the table, and so you're useful to your family, but the job does not find you as an individual useful. Everybody is exactly the same. That's what makes Uber work. I don't know how many people have talked to a lot of Uber drivers, but most of them hate it. They absolutely hate it.
I just
Just like my great-grandmother found meaning in the fact that she was sewing whatever she was sewing there and paid by the piece because she was helping to provide money to educate her children, she did not find meaning in the work. And I think we need to ask ourselves, as we're sitting here and thinking about educational responses, what kind of educational response, training, higher ed, whatever it is, allows people to develop the things that are unique to themselves so they can actually find more meaning in their work.
I violently agree with you.
So I'm going to throw cold water on the discussion for just a second because we should take it to lunch, which happens now. So I'd like to take a moment to thank our three panelists for the wonderful discussion. And I'd encourage all of you to strategically place yourselves at lunch to continue the discussion. Lunch is in the same room that we started at, in the terrace. And the last part of the announcement, at 12:55, we're going to take a group picture on the lawn of the terrace. So do not run away at the end of lunch. Come down and take a group picture, all right? Thank you very much, and we'll see you after lunch for sure. Actually, at 12:55 for the picture, and then we'll meet back in here. Thank you.